Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Saw some folks shuffling in. So this afternoon, we're going to be talking about current trends in research on serious mental illness, with a particular focus on research trends in psychosis. Dr. Golden and myself have no disclosures to report. Our goal today is to tell you a bit about future direction. So what research trends are going on right now that are likely to shape the future of care over the next 10 plus years. We're going to tell you about some clinical trials. We're also going to talk a little bit about what do you do as you select evidence-based care when evidence is still accumulating. You have some folks in your office. What are some principles you can use to select treatments that are as empirically based as possible? We're going to focus on a number of areas, but in particular trauma is a particularly relevant topic for work with all serious mental illness, particularly psychosis. So we are here from the Assoc EDAP clinics. We are in the Department of Psychiatry at UC Davis. We are a world leader in early psychosis care. We are one of the oldest programs in the country. Our goal is to improve outcomes for youth with serious mental illness. Just a little bit about us. We have a couple of prongs to the work that we do. I won't talk a lot about this. You can ask us questions if you like afterwards. But we have a combination of an early intervention, first episode in clinical high-risk clinic. We also do a lot of community education, as well as some dissemination and implementation training other counties in the state of California how to implement evidence-based care and build programs for early psychosis. We also have a large training opportunity and a fairly large research program that we and our colleagues are involved in. We have both federal funding as well as the state of California has quite a bit of support and resources for clinical care. A number of R01s and a few other state-specific areas of funding. More interesting, I think, is the discussion of evidence-based care. We all use this term, empirically based, empirically validated treatment. So the question is, what does it take to actually get that line, that label that we all seek and want to use? I will tell you that the path from hypothesis, I think this treatment will work, to full empirical validation is a really long and winding one. It takes maybe at best some number of years, but more reasonably some number of decades. So as you think about advances in the care that we provide, sometimes our clinical needs can outpace the evidence that we have. We think about this research as sort of spanning this efficacy to effectiveness continuum, meaning research on what works under sort of ideal conditions in the laboratory to what works in real-world scenarios. And this work is sort of iterative. There's a lot of back and forth. This is a spectrum movement from one side to the next. Randomized clinical trials are sort of thought about as the gold standard of treatment studies, but there's really a lot more to this process than that. So once you have a treatment and you've determined that it has some effect, the next step is to determine, okay, this is valid. In whom is it valid? What populations show some effect for this treatment? And that takes replication of studies in new samples, in new places. Eventually, you accumulate enough of these that you might be able to do a meta-analysis where you sort of combine a number of treatment studies and look for the true effect. How much improvement does a treatment give you? Once we've done that, now we want to ask questions like, okay, how does group or culture or country or ways of understanding mental health affect whether these treatments have effect? Does something that we've tested in this country work in China, or with immigrant populations, or various different communities? And the evidence sort of accumulates. So empirically based is not an all or nothing thing. It's something that accumulates. So we are here to tell you a little bit today about what do you do when this is still accumulating? When evidence for a specific concern is still in process, how can you pick a treatment that is most likely to work for your clinic or your client? And the principles in general are to pick things that are known to be effective for similar mechanisms in other populations. That's often how we pick treatments to test. And sometimes you're left to weigh the risk-benefit ratio of a particular treatment in your particular client. We'll show you some examples here. So, in doing so, I think our focus is going to be kind of a lightning round here. We're going to tell you about 10 or 12 different areas that are currently shaping up that seem to have a lot of clinical trials being conducted at the moment, some of which are likely to become care that perhaps you will provide later on. So one particular area, promising area, is treatment for cognition in psychosis. Other mental illness too, but when we think about schizophrenia, cognitive symptoms actually are now defined as a core symptom of schizophrenia. These difficulties are common, and they vary from person to person, but in general, they are in parts of, they are functions heavily reliant on sort of frontal and mediotemporal parts of the brain. So things like speed of processing, difficulties with attention, working memories, or ability to kind of work on things in your head, manipulate them in your head, verbal and visual learning, executive functioning, so planning, higher level thought, problem solving, social cognition. And the reason this is so interesting for our treatment is not necessarily because we want to improve people's memory, but because there's a really strong link between cognition and real world functioning. It's a really robust finding that these two very strongly correlate. So the hope is if you can improve cognition, maybe you can improve how people are doing at work, building social relationships, or at school. So to examine this, a major topic, this will shape the horizon, but this actually currently is a really hot topic, is on cognitive rehabilitation programs. These are called a couple of different things. But the idea is that by improving cognition, think about like lumosity, ads that you've probably seen on TV, you may be able to improve functioning. And the science here is borrowed from similar science in other populations. There are two types of cognitive rehabilitation programs, what we call compensatory and what we call restorative. So compensatory cognitive training is like a top-down type of treatment. So this, I think about this as like a scaffold. You're teaching people how to use memory strategies, taking advantage of the skills that they have, using a planner, to remember things if you struggle to remember things. Identifying the fact that you have some planning difficulties, so writing things down. Working with people, what strategies can you use? Versus restorative, which are like repeated practice of memory games, or repeatedly working on your attention in order to improve the very basic skills and the processes that are happening in the brain. Again, these may be things that you do. These may be things that are done in other populations. So there's some benefits to each. I'm not going to talk a lot about this. What I think is interesting is the evidence. So our evidence broadly shows that bottom-up type training does in fact work. People get better at these particular skills and strategies. Not only do they get better, but in neuroimaging studies, we're able to see changes in the volume and function of particular parts of the brain that are impacted in psychosis. So these parts of the brain become more active. We actually see volume increases. Get larger. We are having an effect on the structure of the brain by doing these basic skills. Fortunately, we we are generally finding that these structural changes don't by themselves translate into improvements in function. That had been the hope, but just by improving cognition, we're not improving the actual functioning. However, some of these top-down strategies that we try to do work. So I think in the next 10 years or so, you are likely to see these types of programs being integrated into evidence-based care for particularly early stage serious mental illness. So, a little more likely are some current trends with a little bit less empirical validation, a little less research support. And I would say broadly, these are categorized in a number of ways. They are taking us towards precision medicine. The idea that mechanisms may be different across individuals. If we can detect specific mechanisms in a specific individual, we target those with very specific treatments, as opposed to the same treatment for all people with psychosis, all people with bipolar disorder. I think another major area is in implementation. So once you have treatments that work, how do we roll them out in real-time, real-life, community-based clinics? How do you teach people to do the treatments? I think one of the best examples of this right now is the area of psychosis risk syndromes. In the back of the DSM-5, we now have attenuated psychosis syndrome. We also talk about these as clinical high risk or ultra high risk syndromes. People familiar with this? Maybe a nod of the head or a raise of the hand. So the notion, the basic notion is that we have developed over the last 20 years or so evidence-based assessment measures that can detect people with symptoms of risk for psychosis. And at best, we are right about 20 to 30% of the time. About a quarter to a third of the people that we identify as at risk for psychosis do in fact go on to develop it over the next 1 to 2 years. The treatments specifically for risk syndromes, unfortunately, are lagging a little bit behind the identification research. We spend a lot of time trying to find people. So it's a really nice example of this idea of evidence accumulating. But what do you do once you found the people if you don't have clear signs on what works? So we have developed combined treatments. That's sort of the state of the science right now. Typically altering treatments that have been effective for depression, anxiety, and first episode psychosis, sort of modifying them. These are programmatic treatments, so they tend to be a combination of a bunch of things. We're going to talk about some of the current evidence-based tomorrow. If anybody is interested, we'll talk a little bit about this. What we found, there's no gold standard. There's no one thing that you ought to do with someone with psychosis risk syndromes. But our best sort of programmatic care has a risk reduction of 54% and a number needed to treat of 12. What that means is, from our best programmatic systems, you need to treat 12 people with risk syndromes in order to prevent one new incidence of psychosis. That's sort of what that statistic translates to. So, in the absence of specific gold standard treatments, we have some evidence-based guidelines. These have been proffered by a number of panels of experts. So up here is, I think, one of the major ones, the European Psychiatric Association. There are a number of others. There's one from India, there's the Canadian Psychiatric Association. There are a number of them. They're all pretty consistent. And the guidelines are basically use evidence-based assessment measures by trained people. There are some out there. SIPS is a really common one. CARMS is another big one. The suggestion is that people who are trained in doing these do them. The next principle is to treat co-occurring symptoms or concerns that are present, as opposed to specifically trying to prevent psychosis. So this is treating depression, anxiety, sleep and attention problems are really common. And then interventions that are designed to prevent functional decline. How can can we help people stay in school? And we work with them to develop IEPs to support vocational efforts. These are really the evidence base. Unfortunately, our psychosis prevention science is not great, and a lot has been tried. Antipsychotics don't seem to do a good job of preventing the onset of psychosis. So the principle here is to use a least restrictive, least risky, staged approach. Starting with psychotherapy, this is the risks of doing damage with your interventions are relatively low. Moving on to medication, things like SSRIs, only moving to a low-dose second-generation antipsychotic when these other treatments have not had. As we're doing this, we're trying to develop risk calculators, also a really hot topic right now. These are motivated by the Framingham heart study. People are familiar with this. It was a cohort-based study started in the 40s that has followed people. It's actually still following people, trying to identify, if you follow people over their lifetime, what factors in 1948 predict heart disease in 2019. And once you find risk factors, you can put them together to build algorithms that give you a predictive score. And then you can plot people's individual scores on particular measures into those algorithms to determine who's most at risk and intervene in those people. Similar programs for diabetes. You've heard about pre-diabetes. That's an example of this type of strategy. In the Framingham study, you can actually get 30-year risk scores. So you can find out at age 40 what the risk of heart disease is at age 7. Pretty impressive. We are trying this in serious mental illness. There are some particular problems with identifying risk in psychiatric conditions as opposed to physical health conditions. Most principally that risk factors themselves are sort of hypothetical, probabilities. Saying somebody is at a probable risk. The actual factors that go into this are dynamic. They interact, they're constantly changing. You're often basing your assessment of risk of somebody on a one moment in time assessment. But if you think about environmental risk factors for psychosis, for example, these change. You may be in an environment now that's very different 2 years from now. And so your level of risk changes these different factors that impact you in different ways. There are a couple of these out there. You can actually go and find them. If you are somebody with an expertise in early psychosis assessment, you can use these. There are two major ones. One, the Maples risk calculator, was based on a large study of longitudinal study conducted here in North America. There are 8 sites across the US and Canada. And they followed people for 2 years and identified which factors at baseline predicted psychosis 2 years later. There's another one that was done in London. This is a birth program, so it's a larger sample using the registry that identify factors that predict. And basically, you enter people's scores on these different factors, similar but not the same factors in the London version, and it spits out probabilities. So, I put into both of these pretty similar factors. So it tells you over the next couple of years, what is this person's statistical probability of developing psychosis based on this moment in time right now. And you can decide if it's high, perhaps this is a person that needs a little more attention and resources. And if it's low, it might be somebody that can bring back and sort of reassess them. Genetics, of course, is a very hot topic. We have been talking about genetics in psychosis and schizophrenia as long as we had a term, psychosis and schizophrenia. So as far back even as Kreplin and the earliest days of identification of these illnesses, even actually like the Greeks and Romans talked about heritable factors of psychosis. So a lot of attention. We know these accumulate in families. The closer you are in relation to somebody with schizophrenia, the more likely you are yourself to develop schizophrenia. So it suggests heritable factors. And particular attention since the Human Genome Project, so again about the last 20 years, as we have been able to actually code the whole human genome. To look for association between particular genes and incidence of psychosis. We had hoped to find some smoking gun, some individual genes. Unfortunately, it's actually quite complicated. So the state of the science now is showing hundreds, maybe even more, genes that associate with increased incidence of schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. This graph over here is what's called a Manhattan plot. This is the entire human genome. So you can see on the x-axis is chromosomes, and mapping particular genes, little SNPs that associate with increased risk of psychosis. So everything above this line is something that has a higher rate related to a higher rate of psychosis. Most of these are brain factors. Yeah.
Question. It had been discussed in the past that the 6B chromosome was the most likely. Are you guys saying not true anymore?
Yeah. So
6B's out?
Well, there are many things that are in, right? And different people do research on their particular favorites. I don't know that there's one heavy favorite. Dr. Bull, I don't know if you'd add anything to that.
No, I wouldn't say that there is a specific favorite gene. For a while it was DRD1, then it was COMT, then it was the specific chromosome, then it was 22 at certain locations. And there isn't one that has consensus behind it where this is the one. There are different, each gene, each location on each chromosome combined with certain environmental factors are what may put you at risk. So that's why having those risk calculators is helpful, because it's all these different factors piled on.
Yeah. So in specific studies, any particular gene is accounting for maybe 2 to 3% variance. You're looking at incidence of psychosis. The individual genes are really small effects. Combinations of genes actually are large effects. So interestingly, in this Manhattan plot, so these are all, here is your 6. This really large, Empire State Building is actually not brain-related factors. These are immunofactors, which has become a really hot topic. So what the science is going towards is something called a polygenetic risk factor. So it is also an algorithm. Now that we can actually, you can go into the doctor and have your genome sort of decoded, and you can look for the particular markers that have been related, put them into an algorithm that then results in a risk score. And that's what people are doing research on now. There's plenty of individual gene or SNP studies, but I think the future is polygenic. So related to that, I'm going to zoom through a couple other things. Because of this large spike, this Empire State Building, there's a lot of focus right now on neuroinflammation, psychosis, depression, anxiety, bipolar, all are showing increased levels of neuroinflammation. We don't really understand the mechanisms here. There are a number of hypotheses, but the idea is that this may bridge the gap between stress and psychosis. It may bridge the gap between environmental risk factors and psychosis. It may explain these things. So some of the theories are that neuroinflammation itself may be a marker of ill brain health. Things are going wrong in the brain, it gets inflamed, just like in your body, right? If something's going wrong, you get an inflammatory response. It may also be a marker of environmental stressors, right? When you are mismatched in your environment, you may get subtle inflammatory sort of flares, and some of the response that your body produces crosses the blood-brain barrier and has some effects on the brain. I'll talk about this a little more on the next slide. Your skull physically goes right? So if your brain is inflamed, pressing on the skull, pressing on itself, could itself cause symptoms of psychosis. And we see this with organic psychosis, right? Tumors, or brain damage. This is one of the ways that tends to lead to symptoms of psychosis. We also think infections early in life could disrupt later immune function or brain health. So this may be a marker of early life insults, which also affect incidence of psychosis. So the future here might be anti-inflammatory treatment targets, medications for inflammation to treat mental illness. Very interesting. Related to this, I'm not going to talk a ton, is research on the microbiome. The interest in treatments for diet to treat psychosis, which a lot of our clients and families really like the idea of, right? Something non-invasive, easy, that you can do at home. Unfortunately, these have incredibly small effects, but they do have an effect. So one theory is that changes in your microbiome, microorganisms that live in such a gut, also could cause some autoimmune responses that, again, cross the blood-brain barrier, have some effect on the brain. And there's some really interesting research, pretty actually robust and consistent research, showing that individuals with schizophrenia have different microorganisms, lower microbial diversity than controls. And when you transplant these microbes into rodents, for example, those rodents develop symptoms that seem to resemble psychosis. So there is something going on here. Related is stress. This has cooled a little bit in recent days, but I would say in the last 10 years or so, HPA activity and cortisol has been a really hot topic. Cortisol is a hormone produced by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, your brain's natural stress response system. So in response to environmental stressors, think about adversity or trauma, or even day-to-day stressors, which actually seem to be more related to psychosis. You can get chronic elevations in cortisol and other glucocorticoids, which themselves are bad for the brain. These cause long-term systemic structural and functional changes, and those functional and structural changes are in the same part of the brain that is affected, the same parts of the brain that are most affected in psychosis. So this also has some implications. Glucocorticoid treatments could themselves help with psychosis, and in fact do. In individuals with psychosis who have chronically elevated cortisol, controlling their cortisol does tend to result in decrease in symptoms. I think another fascinating area, and I'm going to hand the microphone off, is on social determinants of mental illness. I would say this is not unique to psychosis, but has been of particular interest in psychosis. Social inequality is systemic, not just in this country, in everywhere. Creates differences in social, economic, and environmental circumstances. Think about the neighborhood you live in, the way you're treated, living conditions, the school that you go to, the types of jobs that are available to you, education that you get. So social determinants are defined as social, environmental, and behavioral risk factors that result in physical, mental health, disease, and morbidity. So if these distribute in unequal ways that also relate to incidents of mental health and physical health, we can study those and better understand what the mechanisms are. Potentially those are really good targets for environmental interventions. So the last thing I'll talk about, I'll mention to you, you can actually go online and there is a registry of all the clinical trials being conducted at this moment. I did this a few days ago, and you can see, if you look for current clinical trials that are interventional in nature, we have 2,000 currently registered. We're just trying to identify a couple of the trends here, more than a couple of. Some of the most frequently identified studies being conducted, these are them. So a lot of pharmacology right now. Not just medications that we know of, but specific, really specifically tailored new medications that target specific mechanisms. We're looking at different combinations of medications, different sequences, this or that, what works better. Can you give one thing in addition to another thing to have a better effect than either of those alone? There's a lot being done in complementary and alternative medicine, some mindfulness studies, yoga, acupuncture, things you may do in clinics, in addition to the active treatments, but actually they're active themselves. How do these relate or fit in? A lot of deep brain stimulation or transcranial stimulation, really hot topic at the moment. Specific cultural adaptations. How does an intervention designed in the West work elsewhere, or in particular specific cultures? How can you adapt one treatment to better fit the sort of organic elements in a different culture? A lot of diet, microbiome, metabolic mechanisms. Peer-led interventions, early hot topics of people themselves who have lived experience of mental health symptoms. How effective are they? Virtual reality, sleep, oxytocin, or more than I was surprised by how many I saw there. Vitamins, cannabis is a hot topic, and then various like implementation, screening methods, and health-related things. So, colleague Dr. Goldman.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shapiro. So at the start of this talk, Dr. Shapiro mentioned, what do we do when there is no particular gold standard treatment or when it's still emerging? So I'm going to talk a bit about a particular implementation that we have focused on in our clinic and in our research, and that is trauma-informed care for individuals with psychosis. So I'm not going to belabor this. I'm sure most of you are familiar with what exactly trauma is, but trauma is any particular stressful or traumatic event that includes exposure to or witnessing certain things that threaten serious bodily injury or sexual violence. Trauma in psychosis is more common than one would think. Trauma, the incidence of PTSD or trauma-related symptoms in the general population is at 6.8%, but it's at 23% in persistent psychosis. Up to 80% of individuals who are in that ultra-high risk or clinical high risk attenuated syndrome that Dr. Shapiro discussed in the beginning have had some sort of exposure to trauma. Trauma is poorly diagnosed in individuals with SMI, particularly with the idea of differentially diagnosing hallucinations versus flashbacks, suspiciousness versus the reaction to trauma. So thinking of someone who's like, yes, of course I carry a taser with me wherever I go. Is that because I'm paranoid? Maybe not. If you've had exposure to trauma and you're worried about it happening again, you tend to act differently. So that kind of hypervigilance is clearly a hallmark of trauma, but it's someone who might have a risk for psychosis and often is diagnosed. So a history of trauma exposure and psychosis is associated with more severe symptoms, worse social functioning, increased substance use, hospitalization, and risk for homelessness, and death by suicide. So clearly there is a need, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's a developed treatment for it. And I'll talk about that in a bit. So these are some of the negative consequences for trauma. There was a big study called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Events, that was focused on determining what sorts of issues in childhood lead to serious mental illness later in life. And the ACEs study shows that child abuse alone is a dramatic, a particularly significant risk factor. And by reducing that, you reduce the incidence of serious mental illness very substantially. Trauma is a public health issue and far-reaching, and particularly because of the risk in psychosis, it's something that needs to be addressed. So if you look at this, when you have childhood trauma, there's an impact on cognition, attention, and learning. If any of you have seen children who have been exposed to trauma in your classrooms or in your mental health clinic settings, you'll notice that a lot of these things are impaired. Being able to regulate one's emotions, being able to adequately assess whether or not someone else is a threat, being able to adequately assess whether or not you can trust another person is significantly impacted by that exposure to trauma when you're a young child. And so you see this poor school functioning, and then you see a significant relationship with substance use. For physical health and disability, particularly if you're exposed to what we call complex trauma or chronic trauma, so not one singular event, yes, I was called up at gunpoint, but that repeated exposure as in child abuse or emotional abuse or neglect. And then we see the significant impact with mental health disorders, depression, anxiety, trauma, but also psychosis, and what we call re-victimization. So individuals who have been exposed to trauma once have a greater likelihood of being exposed to a second traumatic event than individuals who have yet to be exposed to trauma. So what all this means is a greater risk for suicide, incarceration, and homelessness. So trauma risk factors in psychosis. We have that genetic vulnerability in psychosis, or that biological vulnerability. Are many of you familiar with the diagnosis stress model of mental health issues? Nodding. Awesome. So that diagnosis stress model is particularly salient in individuals with psychosis. So the buffer that you have for how much stress you might be able to handle is diminished as your biological or genetic risk for psychosis increases. And while we don't have a great, as Dr. Shapiro was saying, we don't have a great idea of what genes might be involved, we know that someone who has a first-degree relative with psychosis has a greater chance of developing psychosis themselves. So their buffer for how much trauma or stress they can be exposed to is significantly lower than someone who doesn't have a biological or genetic risk. So when you have that biological risk and trauma, then you have this altered developmental trajectory. So you have, again, poor emotional regulation and coping skills. You have significant difficulty with a lot of cognitive functions, etc. That then leads you to have an altered academic performance, and so on and on and on it goes. You see this cascade. Additionally, then that leads to this kind of psychotic-like experiences, those attenuated symptoms of I thought I heard something. It just feels like someone's watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck are constantly standing up. There must be some sort of reason for that. And then you've got that increased vulnerability to future trauma. So in general, individuals who have these psychotic experiences and have this previous exposure to trauma are more likely to be exposed to traumatic events. Again, that hypervigilance and reactivity to threats can sometimes then lead someone to be confrontational, which can then lead to them being re-victimized by another individual who then leads that aggression with their own aggression. You'll see that kind of comes through social support, which can also lead to homelessness, which again is a risk factor for trauma. So all of this means that you're back to this kind of circle of you have the one traumatic event, and then you saw this cascade, this altered trajectory, now we're at another traumatic event, and again, the increase in symptoms goes up. All right, so evidence-based treatment of trauma and psychosis. There are no evidence-based treatments for trauma and psychosis. So there's a lot of empirically supported treatments for trauma, for PTSD, or even just trauma syndromes and symptoms, but not necessarily in psychosis. There are CBT methods for treating trauma that's trauma-focused, CBT, or cognitive processing therapy. There is prolonged exposure developed by Anfoa and her group that has significant findings in particularly individuals with sexual trauma. And then eye movement desensitization processing, EMDR, is the more emerging trauma treatment that has shown some significant impact. There's the exposure can be imaginal or in vivo, actually taking someone back to the place where they were victimized to help them alter that anxiety cascade response. And there's evidence growing for other therapeutic interventions like personal therapy. But the first line should be empirically supported treatment. So because there's no treatment that's technically been developed for treating trauma in psychosis, it's important for us to say, okay, what are the gold standards? What's the evidence for treating trauma, hearing it, and then how can we actually adapt that to this clinical population? treating trauma in established psychosis. There are multiple small studies going on using certain EVPs, such as cognitive processing therapy, some prolonged exposure work as well, mostly EMDR, etc. There's only one clinical trial on exposure-based treatment by Vandenberg and colleagues, and both PE and EMDR reduced the PTSD symptoms compared to a wingless control, but prolonged exposure resulted in full remission versus EMDR. Studies of CBT without exposure are pretty mixed. So CBT plus treatment as usual decreased PTSD and other symptoms compared to Talcone in one study, but we didn't see that reduction in another study seeking to replicate it. So both studies noted that exposure must be key to the effectiveness. Now, you're probably wondering, if there's so much risk for trauma or so much incidence of trauma in psychosis, why is there not already some sort of trauma treatment for this population? And there are answers for that. I don't know the good answers, but there are answers nonetheless. And so the reason is because there was the idea that treating trauma in psychosis would make the psychosis symptoms worse. You might be able to help with some of the trauma symptoms like that, maybe not hypervigilance, but the avoidance of memory, the reoccurrence of symptoms when they're triggered and things like that, but that it would ramp up their hallucinations or sometimes their delusions and things of that nature. There are also just barriers in general. It's hard to differentiate some of the trauma symptoms from the psychosis symptoms. They often interact and exacerbate each other, so if you're having hallucinations and it's the voice of your perpetrator, that's clearly going to make your trauma symptoms worse. And it's very intense.
So, in terms of trauma treatment for a person with schizophrenia, significant psychosis, would you agree or disagree that it accelerates the severity of psychosis? Or is there evidence to show us that, yes, we should implement this because it's going to decrease the severity of psychosis, long-term we're good? Or does the evidence seem to suggest, nope, you're going to be on this episodic railway here and it's maybe not safe?
So that is a great question, and I will show you some preliminary evidence that shows that treating trauma does not harm, as it is once thought to do, and that it can indeed improve psychosis symptoms, not just the trauma symptoms. So it's how we implement it is the key. You can't just walk in and say, hey, you've got hallucinations, don't worry about that. We're going to do some prolonged exposure. You're going to hear your trauma over and over again, and you'll have some coping skills in the game. You'll be fine. That clearly cannot be the case, and so I'll talk about the implementation of how to do it so that we are considering those risk factors, but we're also working to improve those trauma symptoms and then decrease the psychosis symptoms as well. Thank you. All right, so another reason that it's very hard is that usually we tend to stay in our own camps. I'm a psychosis person, I hang out over here, depression hangs out over here, we don't often hang out with each other. And therefore, trying to treat trauma in psychosis meant that a lot of people just didn't have supervision and the training to do it. So that is also another identified barrier. So how can we do this? So we developed a training program with the support of HRSA, and it's a collaboration between our early psychosis clinics and the trauma care center at UC Davis. We worked with individuals between the ages of 12 and 30 who were within 2 years of their first psychotic episode or had a clinical high-risk syndrome. And we were building upon the foundations of trauma-focused CBT. Is everyone fairly familiar with TFCBT? SCORE. So I'll tell you a bit about how we were able to implement this treatment. So we had to prioritize our treatment approach. There was a hierarchy. So a client comes to the clinic. If they have psychotic symptoms or APS and no trauma, they get the gold standard cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis, pretty straightforward. Psychosis symptoms and APS symptoms are prominent, past trauma reported, but no current distress. Again, we complete a full assessment. If If they're not reporting any trauma symptoms, we do CBTP with psychoed about trauma, how it could present itself, so that if they do ever have those symptoms, they can be addressed. If individuals have prominent and severe psychosis symptoms with trauma present, we focus on stabilizing those psychosis symptoms first. So if someone's clearly constantly going in and out of the hospital, they're frequently disorganized, we're not going to start our trauma treatment with them. We're clearly going to focus on helping stabilize that client. Once we complete that stabilization and have finished our assessment and our case conceptualization, then we can start to work on the trauma integrated CBTP. Trauma is a recent event, or trauma symptoms are prominent and psychosis symptoms are stable. We again complete our assessment and we can focus on the trauma. So you can see the different types of individuals that we're working with and how we approached working with them on their trauma symptoms if they were present, so that they were able to manage their psychosis symptoms while we were working on the trauma with them. So TI-CBT has some core components. We first provide psychoeducation about psychosis, substance use, and trauma. So we talk about, we do a lot of work on what their symptoms are, what they look like to them, how they feel to them, how they feel to their support person, how they look to their support person is particularly important, because what the individual might feel is, yes, I was hearing a lot of hallucinations and I started to want to harm myself. What their parents might say is, I started to notice that they were always in their room. I could not get them to come out their room. So being able to understand what it looks like for everyone involved is particularly helpful. We talk about common reactions, we talk about increased risk, how to manage stress, because stress can make your symptoms quite a bit worse or exacerbate them rather. And then we move on to skill building, really focus on helping them develop their coping skills, both for their psychosis symptoms as well as for eventual trauma exposure work. So how to manage your hallucinations, how to manage how to do some hypothesis testing for delusions, things of that nature. And then we focus on things like relaxation techniques, affect regulation, emotion identification that will help with the eventual trauma work. We move on to enhancing their supports, making sure we're involving their support persons and teaching them these skills to scaffold the client so that they're able to use them when they're not in our office, because of course we see them once a week. Learning for me once a week for an hour while I might be off does not mean for anyone to go into the world and say, okay, I've got this. They have to practice, and it's usually their support persons helping them practice. Then we start doing some safety planning, how we manage a relapse. Because psychosis is episodic, we know the likelihood of them having another episode is particularly high, so how do we manage that? Recognizing the signs and symptoms of another episode, and then being able to deal with that. We talk about abuse prevention and healthy relationships, etc., and then we move on to the exposure. We do gradual exposure to maintain stability. We will step out and do family sessions if necessary. So it's not just straightforward, like, okay, 4 sessions of the trauma work. We're going to do some exposure and that's it. We have to make sure that we're constantly managing what psychosis symptoms they might have and balancing that with how they're doing on the exposure. We do national and in vivo, so we've definitely gone out into the community to work with them to help them regulate their affect if they are particularly scared of a certain place where their trauma may have occurred. And we complete a trauma narrative with them. So before we do exposure work, it is so important for us to make sure that they have been stable with their psychosis symptoms for at least a month. That means no med changes, no significant increases in their psychosis symptoms, and we use different evidence-based assessments to be able to track that and measure that, as well as, of course, their subjective reports and those reports of their support persons. So, when we're talking about implementation, Dr. Shapiro made the excellent point that we develop these treatments within somewhat of a vacuum. And tell, when we're doing these RCTs, we focus on, I need this regimented, structure to make sure that this thing works over and over again. And then we say, okay, now let's go into the community and do it. And that's where We're like, okay, I can't do this like lovely 12-week thing exactly the way the manual says. So you have to consider how you adapt things for your particular client and their population. So I won't belabor this, but there's a great deal of information about how mental illness in general, but also trauma specifically, is discussed amongst different individuals and culture. I think the biggest point that I want to make here is to ask. Ask them how it's talked about in their families and their communities, so that you're making sure you're using the appropriate language and nomenclature, so that you aren't further stigmatizing them where they feel like what you are telling them to do will not be adequately supported in their home or in their communities. Do you have a question?
Yes, we are now supervising and navigate first step psychology program. And so I wonder if this is also a manualized program, or you guys are working out?
So we are currently in the process of publishing a paper for it where we talk about the implementation. I'm seeing some head nods and things like that. Yes, we're actually revising the draft while I'm here. So we're revising the draft to submit it. Really what the paper talks about is how to implement it. So the previous couple of slides, this particular way to engage with clients will be discussed in the paper. It's not necessarily manualized because the TFCPT manual is already out there, but it talks about where you're integrating the TFCPT stuff with the general CPT for psychosis care. So this is a case example, and we don't have a ton of time, so I'm just going to briefly go through it. This is a 17-year-old Hispanic male. He presented with his parents to our clinic after he was hospitalized for manic episodes with psychotic features. He started meds and stabilized pretty quickly, but he had witnessed a shooting in his neighborhood at school 3 weeks prior to his first episode. So you can really see that diagnosis stress model right there. He was refusing to return to school or go outside his home. And so while I won't go completely into what we were able to do with him, once he had stabilized on his symptoms, we were able to move forward and really work through the trauma narrative with him, constantly making sure that we're keeping his parents in the loop so they can help scaffold him to use his coping skills, particularly at home and then when he was going back to school. So we started exposure with him going back to school, little by little, with a therapist there, then with a supported education and employment specialist there to help remind him of his coping skills once he got the hang of it, and things of that nature. We had worked with him, in general, he was in our program for about 18 or 19 months before he was discharged. The first 3 months were the case conceptualization and assessment process, and getting a good idea of what's going on meds. Then we started doing skill building, which lasted about a month or 2. The trauma narrative and exposure work, and once it took another 3 months to help inch him along back to school and kind of get at that avoidance. And then the stabilization and wellness plan work was the last of, let's say, 4 months. And after that, we just kept him in our program to make sure he continued to stay stabilized, make sure he continued to go to school, and then he graduated from high school to college. Yes?
How long did you stay on that?
He is currently still on medication. He was taking an antipsychotic and I think an SSRI.
Just curious, have you looked at cases involving vets with post-traumatic PTSD or even hazing victims, which is a big issue in high schools and college? So
we definitely look at a lot of bullying because our population is 12 to 30. We don't get a ton of vets. They go to the VA. They don't often come to us in our clinic, so we haven't done a lot of work with vets. I can't say that I think there was one vet we worked with and he ended up wanting to go back to the VA because all his care is integrated.
So the amount of time, a year, 2 years?
To do this work, 2 years is how long they tend to stay in our program. And that's, if you think about early psychosis work, the first 6 months is usually assessment, conceptualization, and stabilization, and teaching the skills. And then you've got the active treatment, particularly the trauma treatment, for another 6 months or so. Then we're on to wellness planning, and then continued stabilization. Once we realize they're continually stable, then they can go to general outpatient or just med management.
So the VA does a lot of work with PTSD and psychosis. There's surprisingly not a ton of research looking at both at the same time, even in the VA system. There is some.
Really?
But I think it's understudied, yeah.
Wow.
So this is just a good slide about how we manage the challenges. I'm not going to get too much into this. Cognitive impairments, as Dr. Shapiro said, are a particular hallmark of individuals with psychosis, so sometimes we've got to do some of that compensatory work to help shore them up and make sure that they're able to practice the coping skills. A lot of negative symptoms in individuals with psychosis, so that A motivation is there. You couple that with the avoidance that's classic and trauma, and getting someone to do something is not the easiest thing I've ever done in my life. So there's a lot of behavioral activation, a lot of small baby steps. Hey, you showered today. And then helping them continue with that progress. Family histories of trauma can be difficult as well, so making sure that the support persons in their life are also getting what they need is particularly helpful for this population. Here is some preliminary data, and I'm not going to belabor this too much, but upon our implementation, we had approximately 30 individuals over about a 4-year period who we worked with who had exposure to trauma, traumatic events, and had trauma-related symptoms. And about 34% of that population was able to engage in trauma-informed CBTP. And what we saw is that these graphs over here show you that the reduction in symptoms was not significantly impacted by their previous by their trauma work. So the idea that you ramp up your symptoms is not necessarily supported by this particular data. And we see that their rate of reduction matches that of someone who did not get TI-CBT. So again, we're not seeing that ramp up in symptoms that was previously thought to be the consequence of doing trauma work in this population. All right, but yeah.
So I go back to the 18 so working is the funded like state funding or like how is that?
Yes, our program, so our county clinic is funded through the Sacramento, our partnership with Sacramento County. So we've got 2 years to work with them. Our private insurance clinic, which we didn't collect data on, is just private insurance, and they get to work with us for how long they like 6 sessions. Right. Because psychosis is one of the ones that insurance will not deny claims for, we have the luxury of working with them for quite a bit of time. So that is at least helpful. But we only get to do assessments with them once a year, and that kind of leads to us not being able to follow, or we only get to bill for it once a year. So that also does impact things.
Because for us, like for my group, state hospitals, we're looking at Medicaid and Medicare, like trying to get them to get on board with some of this, like United Community Health Policy. Just in these groups.
Yeah. It is a bit different in California than in Florida or Georgia, where Dr. Shapiro used to work, or Tennessee, where I used to work. The Medicaid expansion in California is extensive. We also have what's called the billionaire's tax, sweet tax, an additional 1% for the top 1% in California. That money goes for interventions. So we've got a little bit of luxury that may not be a broad generalization for the nation, but we can talk more about it. Okay, so we've talked a bit about trauma. I am just going to speed past this. Early intervention is important. So there are a great many reasons why, but delays for early intervention lead to higher rates of homelessness, rehospitalizations, and there's significant financial cost to it. So this is just some information on high-risk implementation models. We talk about how we can make sure that we are treating individuals with high risk, comprehensive versus community care, and what sorts of things we should be doing to, as Dr. Shapiro said, try to prevent that 1 in 12 person from developing psychosis. Physical activity and weight management are current trends. As Dr. Schmidt was talking about the microbiome, the gut work that's been going on recently, that's been coupled with a lot of physical interventions. Because antipsychotic medications often have weight gain as a side effect, a lot of focus has been on how we integrate physical education. Also, because people who exercise more, tend to have better mental health outcomes in general. So making sure that they're doing that behavioral activation, and that behavioral activation is also secondarily helping this other thing. And when we see weight management studies, there is significant improvement in their actual neurological structure and function as well. So we know that it's not just working on their baseline, but also helping improve their cognitive performance. And that is it. So thank you so much. Please ask